Alright guys, I got dropped. Connection got dropped. Start all over. Har Tabor, Mount Tabor. This mountain is the site of a battle between the general Barak, who was from the tribe of Naphtali, versus the Canaanite. Oops. I think we're back. And we're back. Okay. So, I'm assuming you heard that last part. And it's interesting because this story is mentioned in the Tanakh, in the Bible, in the book of Judges. And this week's Parsha is Mishpatim, that talks about laws, all of the laws. And so the Haftarah that we read this week is from the book of Joshua, and the first time this mountain is mentioned is in the book of Joshua. So we have the book of Joshua, we have laws, we have judges, we have Mishpatim, this week's Parsha. It all connects, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking of laws, we have a situation this week, speaking of Mishpatim, in Israel, where a bunch of people, namely people who call themselves Zionists, but I don't know how Zionist they are. But listen, these are people who are in their 60s and 70s, maybe even 80s, and they served in the army. You know, they served in the Lebanon War, and they served in the 73 War, Yom Kippur War, maybe even the 67 War. And, they have known Israeli democracy, or have seen what they think is democracy in one way, basically one shape and form, for the past, I don't know how many, let's say 50 years, but at the very least since speaking of Barak, there's a judge named Barak I believe in the 90s or in the late 80s or early 90s, set down a few rules. And one of those rules was something called reasonableness. Only in Israel you have something called reasonableness. It's not anything set in stone. It's just this nebulous concept, where the Supreme Court gets to, based on the case that comes before them, they get to decide if something is reasonable. For example, they don't want to let, what is his name? Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas party, to be the head of the Ministry of Finance. Okay, why? Because he was indicted for financial crimes. So here's the thing. I think he shouldn't be, meaning I think that Bibi should not have even thought to appoint him as that, in that position to begin with. Fine. But if you are the Supreme Court, or you're any body that is coming and saying this guy should not be the Minister of Finance because he was indicted for financial crimes, show us the law where it says that. Show us the law, or the Knesset should sit down. The Knesset, not the Supreme Court, but the Knesset should sit down committee and pass a bill and says any person who is indicted for financial crimes cannot be the Minister of Finance, or Minister of anything to do with money, or maybe even Minister in any cabinet, right? Definitely nothing to do with handling anybody's finances, right? But no such law exists. So what does the Supreme Court do? They legislate from the bench, as they always do. I'm not even talking about something like that was done in America, where you have just individual activist judges. I'm talking about the entire Supreme Court comes and says, this is unreasonable. That was the reasoning that they gave. This is unreasonable. It's not reasonable. As one of my coworkers used to say, it's not readable. Okay. So, that's not really rule of law. That's just kind of like people making up stuff as they go along, based on their own whims and desires, right? Meaning, you could say, well, Tzvi, that does make sense. What they're saying makes sense. The guy should not serve, and why are you so upset that they're doing this? The thing is, not that I'm upset that they're doing this. It's that what this points to is that they can do this with anything they want. You understand? They've been doing this with anything they want, and like pulling Jews out of their homes. Like, for example, ladies and gentlemen, my friend's friend, who has a vineyard in the Shiloh Valley, who's been selling beautiful, wonderful grapes from his beautiful, wonderful vineyards to big wineries in Israel, like Tepperberg and other wineries, who will never admit that they get their grapes from Judea and Samaria, what's called past the Green Line. He had his vineyards demolished. Why? Because some Arab guy came to the Israeli courts with some kind of chicken scratch piece of paper, corroborated by his people in his village, saying that his grandfather supposedly, allegedly, owned that piece of land, even though the guy, and then the court asked him, do you have the deed? He's like, no, I don't have the deed. I can't find the deed. I ain't got it. So, tough noogies, I ain't got it, but here's this piece of paper. Here's a bunch of, people in my village who corroborate this fact because they were around when my grandfather was alive. And so this lefty judge or whoever, a lefty lawyer said, okay, prosecutor or state attorney said, okay, that's totally cool with me. And so this has been tied up in courts for about a year. And now that we have this whole battle over judicial reform, they saw their opportunity and they said, listen, we're going to stick it to these settlers. Right before we go down with the ship, we're going to stick it to these settlers and we're going to send a bulldozer to demolish this. Bibi Netanyahu, to my surprise, said, hey guys, no, I'm going to put a stop to this. But then the head of the military, the Minister of Defense, Gallant, said, no, we're going to do this. The interesting part is that the administration in that area, in terms of policing, it's been basically the Israeli police. And now, what's his name? And now Ben Gvir says, listen, we're going to transfer the administration from the police in that area to the army. So when the defense minister says, we're not going to do this, or when the prime minister says we're not going to do this, the army is going to have to listen to him, as opposed to the police who just do whatever the hell they want. Let me start right? The administration of the police, of the national police. Yeah, guys. So we have this whole these legal battles on our hands. This whole battle over the legal soul, or the soul of the legal apparatus of the country. People think we've had, they think we've had, democracy, what they think is democracy, for a long time. We actually haven't had democracy ever here in Israel, real democracy, much less even a representative republic, which it's not even, it has not been that. Guys, there was a professor in America, I guess you could say he's religious, he wears a kippah on his head and he keeps Shabbat, who basically came out and said, Israel's in danger of having mob rule. What I would say to that professor is, what we've had for the past 70 years actually, in fact, has been mob rule. We are trying to de-mob rulify Israel, right? You could say, well, these guys are, the entire government is right-wing, it's the majority ruling over the minority, and, that's what it is. Ladies and gentlemen, when leftists get power, right, when the majority of the country, doesn't matter what country it is, vote for them, and they're in power, it's interesting, they are never worried about erosion of democracy, right? When they have absolute power, like in America, when they have the presidency, the executive branch, like they had during Obama. They had the executive branch for 8 years. They had basically, for save 2 years, 6 out of those 8 years, I believe, they had the Congress, right? And the entirety, basically Obama appointed all, I think 3 judges, or at least 2, Sotomayor and Kagan, and I think another one. So basically they took over the Supreme Court. They took over all 3 bodies of government. And interestingly enough, the media in America, the international media, never came out and said, oh, this is an erosion of democracy. This is mob rule. Ladies and gentlemen, these people ruled with impunity. Just like the Supreme Court in Israel has been ruling with impunity. They decide who lives or who dies, so to speak. They decide who gets to have their house. Jews in Judea and Samaria, this and that and the other. They decide. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. So now they're in a tizzy. Why? Because they've had all this power for years and years and years, for decades, and all of a sudden now they realize they're not going to have as much power. They're not going to have all their power taken away. As my friend said, we're not going to get 100%. We're going to get like 50% or 60% or 40% of what, of what the right wing wants out of this. Yeah, guys, but these people are losing it. They're losing it. They're going berserk to the point where they just stole a tank. If I drive about an hour north of here to the Golan, ladies and gentlemen, they stole a decommissioned tank that doesn't even run. It's almost like it's a historical relic kind of statue that was put up at a place called Tel Saki, who actually my friend Nachliel's brother oversees, right, or works with, and he does tours over there, and it's a tank from the 1973 war. So what do these Bolsheviks do? They stole the tank, and they put placards on it or something, and they protested it, and they protested this whole thing. Ladies and gentlemen, when right-wingers do something like this, they say that we are extremists, they say that we are, what is it? Committing insurrection, right? But when they do it, it's peaceful protest, it's, civil disobedience, they have their rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of this, freedom of that. So when they do stuff, it's freedom of X, Y, and Z. When people on the right do it, it's, insurrection, extremism. These people, we should be locked up. My friends, now you understand. So, Parshas Mishpatim, laws, judges. B'ezrat Hashem, guys, we're not going to see this come to a head. And, Ehud Olmert, speaking of indicted ministers, and the indicted Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who actually sat in prison as well, came out and said, we're gonna have to have a physical civil war over this. We might get to a physical civil war, guys. And he's the same person that called, and he called him to his face. He called Rabbi Kahana an extremist. Okay, Rabbi Kahana never called for civil war in Israel. Last I checked, but Ehud Olmert did a couple of days ago, and yet he's the freedom fighter and all that kind of stuff, and Rabbi Kahana is the extremist. Ladies and gentlemen, as Rabbi Kahana once said, there were all these attacks on Jews way before the fascist, quote-unquote, Kahana, okay? For decades and decades and decades. So, there was no Kahana, but there were Jews getting slashed, and slaughtered in Hebron, in Yerushalayim, and all these different places in Tel Aviv. Guys, we need to wake up to what actual real democracy is. We've never had it. Mark Levin spoke to Eugene Kontorovich on Fox News, and he showed the brilliance of what the founding fathers of America, I hate to say this, founded, and the system that they created, and Supreme Court, as much as they also have a tendency to legislate from the bench, at the end of the day, they have to follow what's called precedent. They have to follow rule of law. They have to interpret the Constitution, which Israel doesn't even have a constitution. So our Supreme Court here in Israel exists to interpret what? I don't know. They're not interpreting anything. They're just making up their own laws, and they're deciding and decreeing. And so now, B'ezrat Hashem, my friends, maybe, just maybe, we're going to have some semblance of a real democracy in this country. Not that I'm a fan of democracy as a system, but as Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. All right, guys. Shabbat Shalom.